Hello, and welcome to the first episode of Monarchism Unfiltered, perhaps the shittiest podcast you've ever listened to. Let's start with the introduction, shall we? I'm Mkoqsc. I'm pointing, I don't know to what, but I am pointing to Bronze and to
this is
Iam.
me. I'm Bronze Protein, and I'm here, I guess.
Hi, I'm Iam. I think
Well, yes. Well, since this is our first episode, a bit of an introduction is in order, I suppose. This podcast, as many might have guessed by the title, Monarchism Unfiltered, is to discuss topics tangentially related to monarchism. It may or may not include monarchism itself.
Right, let's crack on.
And seeing as this is our first episode, let's start from the basics. Monarchism. What is it? What isn't it? And if you want to go first?
Well, I mean, we can talk about the origins.
I think in terms of what monarchy, I think the only way we can really sort of describe it properly would just be as the most minimal claim possible, which is that society should have a head of state or possibly head of government that is determined through some kind of birthright, and that holds that position then for life. This could take multiple forms. There's lots of monarchies extant in the world today that maybe work rotationally or supposedly elected monarchies, but those are slightly more different. I think when we talk about monarchism, we usually mean birthright, inheritance, lineage, bloodline.
Yes, hereditary monarchies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, while the discussion of elective monarchism is a worthy one, because for some reason many American monarchists, and for our American listeners, yes, they do exist. American monarchists do exist, and no, we're not talking about the Canadians specifically. They are, for some reason, elective monarchism does hold sway in their imagination, so it will be a topic we will have to discuss, but not on this episode.
No.
Yeah, I think that would be, I think at least in terms of what we've previously discussed in terms of what we should start with. I think obviously origins is best, and I think just for the sake of simplicity and in terms of what we know the best, I think we should start really with European monarchies, and maybe sort of Middle Eastern ones, because
I've researched this topic in depth. So, if you two will allow me to take the reins here,
Sure.
I will.
Go ahead.
I'll carry on. Okay, so when we talk about the origins of monarchism, it's always tied to fundamentally where the first state began, where the first hereditary succession took place. These concepts and debates, while important, are often overly ethereal. The truth is, and for the purposes of our analysis, we need to center ourselves to where the first politically and, sociopolitically relevancy of hereditary succession became important. And this is technically both Mesopotamia and Egypt, in which the king in the MC/Lugal in Mesopotamia and the pharaoh in Lower and Upper Egypt were kings by divine right. Though, divine right is a bit too. It doesn't quite encapsulate what they were. They were priest kings. They were kings because they were priests, and their function was they were the first servant of insert God here on earth.
Yes, they would legitimize their reign through their relationship with their deity of choice.
Yeah, this is, as far as anthropological information has to us, is the most simple. Well, simple is perhaps a bit derogatory, but it is the earliest type of monarchism we know of. It is theocratic monarchism or priestly kingship.
Well, if you think about it,
This type of monarchy.
it's the earliest type of civilization we know of, period. I mean, the earliest examples of constructed buildings we have are temples or so-called ziggurats in the Fertile Crescent.
Yes, but the issue is that we don't know if the prehistorical priesthoods were necessarily hereditary, which even when we consider the quote-unquote hereditary priestly kingships of Mesopotamia often failed on that regard, not because of lack of ideological commitment, but brutal and systematic state failure. Turns out the Middle East is a place that a system does not survive for long if it's not made of really stern stuff. And priestly kingships has a serious amounts of issue. Now, before we move further on, and to kind of encapsulate the terminology we're using here, when we use priestly kingship and other terms that we'll use right now, and ultimately until we talk about feudal monarchies, we could really nominate these as traditions of monarchism. So the Bronze Age monarchy, even Greek Bronze Age monarchies, had this sacral character to them. The kings were priests or did a number of religious rites. Mind you, this only applies to early Greek monarchies. Post Alexander the Great monarchies have a different dynamic.
Really, we're discussing monarchies in the classical Greek polis city-states.
Yeah, but this is in any case a very good segue. Because, well, everyone knows during the Orientalizing period, the Greeks were influenced by Egypt, etc., etc., etc. What actually was interesting is about the kingship of the Diadochi, which is rather interesting, because when we think of the Diadochi, most of them, we don't actually know what their titles were. We just know they were kings. I mean, sure enough, the Romans called the later Seleucid dynasty the kings of Syria, the Ptolemaics the kings of Egypt, and all that. But truth is, they were never kings of anything in particular. I mean, the best evidence we have of that as a self-descriptor is of coins from the Antipatrid dynasty of Macedonia, in which they call themselves King of the Macedonians. And by that point, considering the colonization efforts of Alexander the Great, being King of the Macedonians implied being the overlord of far more land than actual mainland Macedonia.
Well,
I mean, also, sorry, interesting question, I think, here of at least in terms of why there is this difference wherein these kings are sort of just in themselves kings. Would it not have sort of been connected to, or at least I can think of an ideological justification, which would be that for these, for Greek religion, you have a certain element of like the heroic or like demigods that you don't, as far as I know, find to the same degree in Mesopotamia or Egyptian religion, with the sort of the Mesopotamian gods.
That is precisely on the money. The most famous dynasties, the Seleucid and the Ptolemaic dynasties, famously engaged in a program of self-deification. While the most famous one is that of the Ptolemaids, because, well, they already had the pre-existing structure of pharaonic Egypt to draw upon, but the Seleucids themselves also engaged in a self-mythologization, a self-deification, more accurately, of the dynasty. With God, I can't remember the Greek god in particular, but with Seleucus himself being portrayed as being in a very Alexander-like fashion, to have been secretly fathered by a god. I can't remember which one it was. I don't think he went as far as to say it was Zeus, but he might have
did.
to say
I
Zeus.
think Alexander the Great's mother said that Alexander was the product of her union with Zeus. She did go as far as to suggest that.
Yes.
Near the end, though. Obviously, it's not the kind of claim you make right upon succession.
Yeah, we have to understand that a lot of what the information we have about Alexander's life was compiled rather late in his life, and obviously paid more attention to sources that were, well, more recently available. And plus, like, Greek historiography at the time was prone to exaggerations and mythification. If not the Greek originals, then the Roman copies or subcopies or copies of copies that got to us.
Well,
yeah, the modern the things that have come through are the ones that are the most scandalous in many ways. Yeah, no, I think there is this interesting point because, like, if you look at sort of in like pharaonic Egypt, there is like quite a high turnover of monarchs compared to say I don't know the Romanovs ruling for 300 years, or like the Rurikid dynasty ruling supposedly for 1,000. Whereas with
Shang dynasty ruling. I guess I understand that, and we are going to reach that right now. Word to use here, because in a Greek context, charisma means something rather different than what the modern word charisma means. But these is the tradition of Hellenic monarchism. The king is king because he is king. Like, it is very hard to explain, because this is kind of us trying to lead in the interlines between what the Romans saw, what we suppose the Greeks did, and what little remains of the actual accounts of the Diadochi. Like, very little survives of the period in terms of official document. In fact, the earliest document of any monarchical ruler who we have their bona fide signature is none else than Odoacer, whose signature survived to us based on a donation he did in Sicily. But this sidetracks us. Hellenistic monarchism is important because, well, first, it, like, in many ways, many consider Hellenistic monarchism the beginning of Oriental despotism, a very loaded term that we won't charge in right now. But
and also, it's the Hellenic view of monarchism is important because, I mean, one of the first people to clarify what a monarchy is of course Aristotle, and his thinking survives in the West for a very long time.
I mean, yes, indeed, but the issue is that we need to understand that the Hellenic monarchies themselves were breaking of tradition, because if you've noticed, I have mentioned almost exclusively so far the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. I have not mentioned the Antigonids, specifically the Antigonids when they got back to Macedonia. Macedonian kingship remained distinctly conservative, with the king still having a large function of priest-king. But where this truly is interesting to us is when this tradition gets appropriated by the Latin, well, the italics, that's the accurate term. And this is where we have one of the most important traditions of kingship that is tremendously important to this day. The king has a lawmaker, or the law king, or the king as a legislative figure. And this is important because this is radically opposite to that of the previous ones. This is to say that the kings didn't make law, but that was not their main function. The ancient Mesopotamian deities made law, but it was their interpretation of the divine law of the gods to the mortals, essentially. The Diadochi, by and large, went to what essentially kept the traditional laws in place ad infinitum, well, we think they did. We don't actually have that many documents saying what they did or didn't do legislatively, so we largely assume that they did. Largely because by the time Rome got there, tradition of strong municipal autonomy remained largely in check. So it is intact. So it is assumed they didn't change much, at least as far as the more Western dioceses is counted. Now, king as a lawmaker is very important because more so than sacral kingship, Hellenistic monarchy, it's the one that has perhaps the most direct view today. King as the ultimate arbiter of the state. Ultimately, the ability of the monarch to give pardons, being the ultimate authority in justice, etc., etc., etc. The Latins, and mainly the Etruscans, the Romans had. I do not need to explain that the Romans had a very negative opinion of monarchy, and their monarchy was not strictly hereditary. It was a kind of elective monarchy. But this is important because this is largely the tradition of monarchism that the Roman emperors would more successfully or less successfully try to implement. Diocletian and later Byzantine emperors are actually famous for their rights of bringing structural, social, and their law reforms that were administrative, social, political, and economic in nature. The reforms of Diocletian and the lauded Justinian Codex. This is important because this establishes the king as and lays ultimately the foundations for absolutism more so than the sacral kingship ever did, which is the king as the source and ultimate arbiter of all legal authority. And hence comes the final of the Western monarchist traditions, the Germanic kingship. And the Germanic kingship here actually fulfills a lot of bloody stereotypes. It is the warrior king, the king that fights, the king that is in the front of the war, the king that exists solely for war. And this is what ultimately separates it from the others. The Hellenistic kings existed because, well, they were kings, and by sheer self-justification, because they were Diadochians since of Alexander. The Bronze Age kingships were because God, or more accurately, because they were priests of God. Roman legal kingship existed because there needed to be a supreme legal figure, which the Romans themselves both proved that did not necessarily need to be a king, but also proved that it could be. The Germanic kingship was famously ephemeris. A king was not a king; he was more accurately described as a war leader that was, well, made king when a major war or campaign was. We have accounts of, I want to say Tacitus, but I'm not sure if Tacitus said this one, of essentially kings being elected by the army, quote unquote, the people essentially. And
I do believe it was Tacitus, because he's one, most famous for writing about barbarians, which wasn't that common.
And they famously raised them on shields to essentially confirm their election. And of all these three distinct traditions, and well, to kind of cover a plot hole, the Pontifex Maximus and the religious and cultic roles the Pontifex Maximus did, which in the Roman monarchy era were also done out by the king in a lesser degree, kind of also goes on to put the priestly functions of kingship that, although not as high played as they were in pharaonic Egypt and city-state Mesopotamia, it was still there. But to go to the point at hand, and here is when we can start really speaking about Western monarchism. This is where the embryonic phase of what we Europeans, and to a lesser extent North Americans and Canadians, well, America actually, like
the New World, really.
Yeah, what the New World considers monarchism. Mostly due to colonialism, not necessarily because the ancient Incas actually acted like this. Sorry about that one.
Well, I mean, at least in terms of comparisons, the Mayans had similar systems in terms of priestly kinghood. Um, the Aztecs were quite different though, and obviously the Incas are very much into bloodlines, to the point that they married brother to sister, and the last one was considered a bastard because he had been fathered by cousins, I believe.
Wow.
So
That's early pedigree collapse right there, mate.
yeah, I mean it's akin to how the no Hawaiian king except for the first gave birth to any children in their own reign, um, because they were all so inbred, that they sort of, like, the genetic structure essentially, it reached the final queen and then just like collapsed, such that I think it like went to a daughter, and now it's to some Republican lawyer, is the official prince. But yeah, sisters and cousins are a very common thing once you introduce bloodline and magic and whatnot into these sort of priestly kinghoods.
Magical thinking, as it's
Magical thinking. I mean, the other interesting point, at least in terms of the Romans, is that they take the sort of this idea that the Greeks introduced of basically early separation of power, wherein the Greeks sort of separate out religious, legal, and military control into sort of separate positions, and you sort of see how these different things will be given to different people. So the Spartans had kings in charge of the military, whereas you have a council of elders in charge of the religion and the legal system. But it's sort of when the Romans really sort of formalize a lot of these distinctions, especially into their law, which is then very influential, and they are really the first people to introduce the concept of sovereignty. The Romans, this is, with like imperium, basically, and I think that's obviously going to be very important as well, especially when you start getting people not so much being like competing kings, so much as like a king of an area, or anything like that, which is
Territorial monarchism.
Yeah, because which is one of the things that's kind of been implicit here, is that for a lot of these people, like the Diadochi and the whatnot, it's just like who's head honcho, and then you like have your chieftains below you. With the Romans, when they start introducing these concepts, you really can then have a king of France rather
than the king of the French. Yes, and that was actually what I was going to segue into. So, and as Iam has graciously pointed out, the Romans ultimately represented, and especially with the introduction of Christianity late in the later Roman Empire, to really kick up that first servant of God on earth to God's vicar on earth logic. Is when we really see like a full 180 of the priestly role, which was kind of becoming secondary in like state propaganda and internal consumption and external consumption ideology, really comes back into the fore. And it's in this crucible of remnants of ancient Bronze Age monarchism, Hellenistic kingship, Romano-Grecian really kingship, and add on to that Germanic kingship, that the first truly Western monarchies start to form. Now, with that said, we need to make a small concession that Iam hinted upon here. The first Germanic kingdoms were not kings of, or kings of the. So, of the Ostrogoths, of the Visigoths, of the Franks, etc., etc., etc. So you might be thinking, okay, this is all very nice, but you mentioned territorial monarchism. When does that come into play? And that comes into play when shit goes south. In short, and this is quite tragic and really shows that more people should really pay attention to internal administration, when Charlemagne couped the Merovingians, the last 6th century, like the last magic, our powers are literally magic, especially magic from our hair, because the Visigoths also did that, as in you could legally depose a Visigothic king if you cutted his hair, and the last Merovingian king was deposed because they essentially tied him to a chair and give him a haircut. Because
there were many variations upon, bodily
hair.
Bodily destruction. For example, in ancient Ireland, it was a man's nipples which determined his ability to be king. So if you cut off someone's nipples, like if there was a sovereignty contest between rival chieftains, the victor would cut off the nipples of those he defeated so that they could no longer contest his kingship.
Yes. How this came to be is a bit of a matter of discussion. Many argue that the hair-based ones come from the Bible and the story of how do you say it in English? Samson. Others argue that they are ancient, oral traditions that, because they're oral, didn't make it to us. For example, a good example, or more accurately, a good hint of this is that when Clovis converted to Christianity and was crowned the first Christian king of the Franks, the Pope at the time referred to him as a proud Ciscambri. No one knows exactly what this means. Some hint that this has something to do with military traditions. The Ciscambri were people famous for their cavalry, and the Franks, although they weren't famous for their cavalry, it was about this time where cavalry was again starting to become a thing in Western warfare.
Some. So it has to do with knightly tradition, because of course in French the chevalier were of course people who ride.
Yes, but we'll go. Yeah. But a lot of other people also say that this refers to a lost body of oral tradition, because we also know this to a certain degree in other tribal societies, like steppe nomads, who claimed kind of exalted names, like for example, how the Eurasian Avars called themselves Avars, even though the Western Gokturks said no, they're not Avars, they're Rauran. No, it's not the Rauran, but essentially, there was a practice amongst tribal groups to claim exalted names for their people, and many of the etymologies of many Germanic tribal names hint to that. The Alamani, all men, Suevi, our own, and our own people, and so on and so forth. So there is this element of we simply don't know.
What sources are sparse.
Yeah, especially in the Dark Ages. But Charlemagne took power, and he instituted the system of missi dominici. This system was, let's send people to the feudal lords of the time, which weren't really feudal because they weren't hereditary. Because in order to understand the origins of feudalism, and territorial monarchism in a way, we need to ultimately understand the predomination of Roman societal institutions in the West, which is, after Diocletian made all professions hereditary, including, military ones, obviously, this kind of created a static class of, I wouldn't say warrior aristocrats, but of just warriors whose main business was to warrior.
Sure.
And in large part, when the Germanics, and especially the Franks, who, might I add, one of the, Clovis's father or grandfather was a Roman federate, Yeah, he was part of the Roman command chain to a degree. So the Franks, by the time they really started conquering Gaul, were already heavily Romanized, or at least their elite were. So a lot of this relied on the traditions, on actually legal practice, because contrary to popular belief, a lot of barbaric kingdoms, especially and more hilariously the Vandals, actually did a lot of work trying to preserve Roman institutions, architecture, and law. In fact, for the longest time, I believe until the 7th century, in Lombard Italy, no less, who were famous amongst the Germans for, who were famous amongst the Germanic people for their anti-Roman attitude, that Roman law still applied as late as the 7th century until, well, 7th century? Yes, 7th century, the 600s, until the law codes that applied to the Germanic inhabitants and the Roman inhabitants were merged into one. But the importance here is this. The societal traditions remained, the bureaucracy had gone to shit, largely because the roads had been cannibalized, hadn't been maintained, infrastructure was all to hell. But the societal structure was still there, even if the infrastructure wasn't. So, what Charlemagne fought to solve this issue of ruling the largest state the West had seen, well, since the fall of the Western Roman Empire, he was to appoint, local counts, comes, which by that point is an ancient Roman title for comes rei militaris, which comes from companions, which also comes back from the companions of Alexander. So there's a pedigree for a title, and these are the first counts. Now, as I said, these counts, especially when the Missi Dominici system was working, were not hereditary. But then this Missi Dominici system stopped working very fast when the sons of Charlemagne started violently fighting over one another.
Well, rather the grandsons of Charlemagne.
Yeah. Well, the kingdom split multiple times.
Yes, but that was after, because of course after Charlemagne you had Louis the Pious, and then his sons start the divisions.
I mean, technically, Louis the Pious was already ruling over a divided empire. Really, the fighting hadn't begun yet. Now, you might say, okay, so feudal lords explains this, but I can see why feudalism might be territorial monarchism, but that's really the origin. No. There is actually a year zero for territorial monarchism, and it's very simple. When Charlemagne crowned himself king of the Lombards. Now you may think, you just told us that the territorial kings were all about being kings of the land, not of the people, so why did Charlemagne's calling himself king of the Lombards imply the year zero of territorial monarchism? Simple, because he wasn't a Lombard. At a core level, this is what it means. You can now be king of a people even though you're not of that people. Like, this might sound absurd in hindsight, and to a degree it is, but it introduced the idea. Like, you no longer had to be of that people. You no longer had to nominate puppet kings to rule over that people in their stead. You could rule directly in so much as early, I suppose in this case, later Dark Ages, infrastructure allowed. So, go on.
Sorry, an interesting point of divergence here, sort of thing that could have been the Visigoths. One of the, I can't remember who specifically, but near the end of the Western Roman Empire, when the Visigoths were still primarily based in the south of France, one of the Visigoths married a daughter of a previous Roman emperor. This was a Visigothic king, and there's some evidence to suggest that he was attempting to make himself Roman emperor, he himself being half Roman. And it's sort of an interesting question of.
But that question went down right to the last puppet Roman emperor, Romulus. His official name was called Romulus, but Augustulus, yeah. God damn it, I can't remember the name of the last puppet emperor. But essentially, his father, the one who put him to the throne, was half Roman, and for that reason could not assume the throne. But his son, he was son of half Roman with a full-blooded Roman woman, that made him Roman. That's not how genetic works, but that's how the Romans believed genetic works, I suppose. Yes. And that's largely a main reason why the father, the one who holded the military power, had to put the son on the throne, because you couldn't be like emperor of the Western Roman Empire and not be the Western Roman Emperor. That's absurd. Like that, and this is why Charlemagne, making himself a non-German, a non-Lombardic king of the Lombards, is kind of important, because although you might argue there had been non-Germanic, and I mean not non-Germanic, non-Lombard kings with the Bavarian dynasty. Well, say that they were non-Lombard is kind of a complicated thing, considering not that long ago the Lombards were in Bavaria. So
and what is interesting about Charlemagne's new title is it says something about the special personal relationships that form under feudalism, because of course the Lombards are not only part of Charlemagne's empire, but in fact he has a special relationship with them as their king.
Yeah.
And this suggests a more personal rulership, which aligns
Indeed.
with feudalism, because in feudalism you have a direct personal relationship between sovereign and vassal.
And vassal to subject and so on. So
yes, and vassals of vassals of vassals of vassals, But they all have a complicated network of personal relationships with each other.
Yes, and with this stage set, we arrive into the earliest and largely the most profound of the early traditions of this is the last tradition of Western monarchism, because when this one falls through, is when the French Revolution happens, and when monarchism is first birthed in a more concrete and defined manner as an ideology. Territorial monarchism is simply, you are the king of this set territory. You are the king of this fiefdom. The fiefdom is given to you by the king, typically on hereditary tenure, though not necessarily, even very late into feudalism, the lease was not necessarily hereditary. A lot of finagling existed. And we can see this shift quite simply in what the kings were kings of. There were no longer a king of the Franks, only a king of France. There was no longer a king of the Visigoths, because the Visigoths got conquered. You had the kingdom of Asturias. You no longer had. You did have the kingdom of the Germans, well into Holy Roman Empire history.
I think they are something of an exception to the rule.
I mean, the issue is that German kingship. Just because it was the origin point of Germanic kingship, meant that Germanic notions of monarchism, which were still very intensely tied to king is elected by the people in time of crisis, logic still applies. To a much later date. Though it eventually did also get to this point. It's really, you only see this transition with the Habsburgs and their magical ability to almost ensure hereditary succession in the nominally elective Holy Roman Empire. Now, and we have in a very disorganized manner talked about territorial monarchism, but to give it a quick and effective rundown is that the land is most important. Now, this is not actually discounting what Bron said of the personal relationship, is that everyone is tied to the land, essentially. Your subjects, they're not subjects of anything. They're tied to the land itself. You cannot sell a peasant, but you can sell the land that he's attached to, essentially. This could be technically considered slavery, and, frankly, you have all the right to consider it slavery. Feudalism, especially as time went on, became rather unbearable.
But what is interesting is at the start, if you are a serf tied to the land, that seems kind of like a poor deal. But a lot of people at the very, very early Middle Ages were actually trying to get themselves into the feudal system because
but that's
because
that,
of the
but
protections it offered. Of course,
yeah,
conditions changed over time.
yeah, but also a lot of people think that it was serf then noble. That wasn't really the picture.
Yeah,
Like
there were
some
quite a lot of steps in between.
mid steps. Now, everyone knows of serfs, and some of you may even know of freemen, right? How many of you know of villains, half villains, and so on and so forth? Turns out the hierarchy was the middle. Yeah, I mean, let's not go into the different feudalisms, quote unquote, of Europe just yet.
That is an episode unto its own.
It's a fucking episode unto its own. To the perceptive listener, feudalism is not a single thing, and it's extremely varied, and it's far too a beast to even touch here in detail. But rest assured,
and that's not
feudalism
even
is
considering
included.
non-European feudalisms like what we have in the.
Calm down with that terminology. That these days would get you cultural imperialism charges, I suppose.
I'm quite sorry if I have offended any of our dear listeners with my.
I mean, let's the issue, and we're kind of illustrating it. The word feudalism is very much charged with a lot of image and very little substance. But for simplicity's sake, feudalism is, for the purpose of this podcast, directly equated to Western European. Well, European. Western European is better. Monarchism, territorial monarchism, in fact.
Yes, that is built up of a network of personal relationships between lord and vassal, going all the way down to serf and up to emperor.
But a thing we need to point out here is, and this is kind of important because it establishes a background. So far, with the exception of the Romans, the state existed in turn of the king. This seems obvious. Hellenic kings by charisma, kings because they were kings. Pharaonic Egypt, priest kings, god kings, etc. Here is where we start to see the existence of a state independent of the king, or the feudal lord, really, when, again, the dynasties of France went to 3 different dynasties by the time the Bourbons got into power, and yet through all those times it was called the Kingdom of France. And this happened at the lower level to feudal lords. Just because a feudal dynasty got wiped did not mean that the title that they held ceased to disappear. Many did, but that was actually far from the norm. In fact, as time went on, you had a plethora of creating more titles, and only much, much later, that old, no one even puts this on the honor roll, titles started finally to disappear. Now, this is the baseline. From the collapse of the Carolingian Empire up until the French Revolution, though the French Revolution does still apply, even though the English Civil War was important in many ways.
Well, I mean, the development of the idea of kingship in England
is extremely important, but the issue is, and as you pointed out,
is also an episode unto its own, really.
Yeah, but as you pointed out, kingship, monarchism as an ideology was created by Robert de Maistre, the first reactionary, really. Now, I will assume that everyone here knows basic history, and by everyone I mean you listeners. I have on high authority that both Iam and Mkoqsc know what the French Revolution bloody was.
Hopefully.
Iam?
Oh yeah. I obviously know about the Meister. I was just laughing to myself there. I didn't want to put it on there. I didn't want to clutter the audio. But yeah, I mean, I think you could argue that maybe King James, the King of England, arguably created. Yes, King of England and Scotland.
Yeah, what was it called? The Basilicon, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think you could argue that he creates monarchism because he really is the first, I think, to formulate something like divine right of kings in
I
a sort
think
of
he's the first to
serious manner.
use that specific term.
Yes, yes, that is fair enough. Like, like the issue is that the N has bronze ends. The conceptualization of monarchism that existed both directly because of the English Civil War is immensely important, because really it's the first conceptualization of monarchism. Because until this point, especially in England, really, um, no one actually reflected on what monarchism was. Like outside of the Greeks, which by this point were largely forgotten. Well, not
Well,
in
I
the
mean, they went, in and
not
out
by
of
the
that.
time not by the time the English Civil War went on, but by the medieval ages were largely forgotten. So monarchism was a thing. It was a state of being, upon which people rarely reflected. And you were going to say?
Yeah, I was going to say there were like in the Baroque period of the Renaissance, there is like legal and political philosophers who do talk about monarchism. But the reason why I say that
Hello?
way that De Maistre or like King James are, or even Filmer and Hobbes, is that for them, like monarchism has a lot of brackets around it. Really, like they sort of see it as the best system. Most of them were quite anti-democratic, but it's not like the sort of the kind of thing. Sorry. Okay, well, it's not like what you get under De Maistre, basically, of this kind of absolutism that becomes properly justified beyond just like fuck you, I'm in charge, as it were, which is what you get with the French or almost.
Actually, you make a very good point. Because, as I mentioned, I just said from the fall of Charlemagne's empire to the French Revolution. That's a lot of time. And although it all could generically fall under the notion of territorial monarchy, as I am rather adequately pointed out, it's changed a lot during this period, even if it was under the same exodus of territorialism first. And I think, sadly, because as you mentioned, most of these were legal debates or legal revisions or etc., etc. Well, in fact, the Basilicon was in fact a legal justification for sovereign immunity, if memory serves, the legal concept, not necessarily an ideological treaty itself. But a thing many people ignore during this period of transition is the commentaries. When absolutism was being implemented, and I could speak from the particular Portuguese case, you had, I believe, a noble, a count. He was one of one of the many economic reformers Portugal had before the Marquis de Pombal came to power. And he famously, besides giving some woke takes on bread, famously had a comment about the state of affairs in the kingdom, and he, to put it succinctly, said something along the lines of, "In the past, it was the needs of the state, the good of the state, etc., etc. Now it's the good of the king, the needs of the king, etc., etc." So, and I think this hits at a crucial point that somewhere between, well, the fall of Charlemagne's empire and the French Revolution, the state had become a thing that had slowly become a non-thing via the process of absolutism. In fact, the ultimate proof that it was a thing was the fact that King Louis, the number escapes my mind, says, "I am the state."
14.
Good with numbers, and I'm bad.
Yeah, the Sun King.
Yes, I mean, if you don't
Yeah,
know which one, it's almost always him.
I know, but I'm bad with
It's fine. You are forgiven.
not by the internet. I'm not. But the Sun King is important because, well, first he said the famous phrase that encapsulates the entire spirit of absolutism, and second, and perhaps less famously, but equally as important, and perhaps the ultimate proof that a notion of state existed that was suppressed, ultimately, intentionally or unintentionally, by absolutism, is that when he died, he said something to the effect, I die, but the state remains. If, dear listener, if you thought absolutism and divine right was just God said I have absolute power to do whatever the fuck I want, you're wrong. Absolutism is most definitely not that.
Yeah, I mean I would argue it's only really in De Meister where you get anything approaching that kind of viewpoint. I know because I mean even Hobbes implies it at times, but he really like Hobbes really I think the Hobbes I think is interesting specifically because unlike De Meister, he isn't committed to lineage, which I think is a sort of interesting distinction that I think with Hobbes, at least within the Western tradition, you see the first possibility of like a sort of continuation of this Roman idea, um, where the king is, or this like Hellenic idea, where the king is not necessarily tied to a certain bloodline, be that the House of Stuart or the Cromwell family, as it were.
Actually, the trifecta of English authors, Filmer, Hobbes, and Locke, encapsulate a lot of the discussions we're sort of pussyfooting around here. How Hobbes famously created the lineage of Adamic descent. Hobbes created the Leviathanic state, and Locke really hated women, and therefore he hated the Adamic lineage theory.
That I mean that is still the most epic line in the whole of Two Treaties of Government. Filmer, are you suggesting that we should have absolute monarchy and heredity? That means you are pro women monarchs. How can you? That's ridiculous.
Completely
But yeah, I
ridiculous.
mean, I think you are correct there that Locke, I think, in many ways sits outside of any kind of tradition of monarchism.
I mean, he said he sits outside of any kind of reasonable mindset, but that's not. No, let's not get that political in the first
That's
chapter.
a whole different discussion. But yes, he's not
Yeah,
what
I think
you'd
that's
think of as a monarchist thinker expressly.
I mean, the issue is that Locke is important because, well, Locke is the father of liberalism, and like, it's important because he's the first explicitly non-monarchist. Like, I think it's Hegel who says the identification of the self via self-recognition or recognizing who you are versus the opposite. Well, someone had to conceptualize a modern day opposite that wasn't the fucking decrepit Venetian city states. Locke really was that. So even if he did not contribute to monarchism itself, he contributed to it by essentially not being monarchist.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think quite clearly. I think also, um, obviously, you've mentioned De Meister, and I think at least then in terms of mentioning people that are important for the development of a lot of like monarchist sensibilities, um, would then be Rousseau. In because Rousseau, in many ways, sits at the end of this sort of Catholic tradition of localism, and he essentially like in many of his works, he's almost akin to a kind of primitivist, that he kind of wants to sort of tear all these things down. And I think one of the sort of significant, like Bonapartist tradition, in many ways, is a response against that. In that, it's this sort of affirmation of this kind of urbanite monarchy in many ways that you sort of see, especially under like Napoleon the Third, and if you want to be very controversial, obviously de Gaulle is the other great Bonapartist, and I think.
Fun fact: the Emperor Napoleon III identified himself as an Orleanist.
Oh yeah, I mean, yeah, and I think you even see this with the Orleanist monarchies, that there is this, because I mean, any of the Spanish conservatives are all like, oh, Rousseau, the devil, he has sort of done all this harm and whatnot. And if you read someone like de Maistre and compare him to Rousseau, they are in many ways kind of opposites, because for like Locke obviously has this concept of like state of nature, and or like he touches on these ideas of state of nature that Hobbes does, but it's really Rousseau who gives us this kind of idea of that the primitive, the simple, is preferred, which emerges from this sort of Catholic tradition, and then it sort of, you see someone like de Maistre respond against that. And I think what's kind of paradoxical, if we sort of are moving now into modern monarchism, i.e. post-French Revolution, is that if you look at like the really popular monarchist movements, they are predominantly localist. They're predominantly sort of Catholic, and predominantly this sort of attempt to use the king as a kind of unification of all these separate communities that allow the communities to be united and remain local, and simple.
Well, I mean, that goes back to what we discussed earlier with how the king can have special personal relationships with different communities.
And sadly, this forces us to actually approach a very intensely complicated topic, the death of feudalism. Oh boy, I feel my life flashing before my eyes. Let's do this quick and dirty, fellas. In short, feudalism died a painful, long death. It relied on an economic system called manualism, which was dead by the 13th century. Yes, the major economic linchpin of feudalism, as many people conceptualize it, was dead halfway through the adventure. Especially if we go by especially if we go by the classical French definition of the end of feudalism, in France being, the French Revolution. Now, to explain how this got to this point is you have to understand that the Bourbon absolutist state is essentially a state that was trying to dismantle feudalism. In other words, by the time feudalism died in France, it was really, there wasn't much left to kill or die, really. The king had concentrated a lot of it, had concentrated a lot of power, specifically local power, into his hands. You had the king appointing tax officers as far down as Aquitaine. Was it Aquitaine by the 17th century? It wasn't. Modern-day Languedoc, basically, which was unheard of because back then tax officials, before this time period, tax officials were either locally appointed or self-elected or bought the position.
Well,
another Roman tradition that survived that people aren't aware of.
Well, what is interesting is, of course, Louis XIV famously said, "I am the state," which, while is often all considered to be him concentrating all the power into himself, which is true. You can also view it the other way, that it's no longer him. It's sort of the state. And so, since he is the state, when people have relationships with him, they have an impersonal relationship. You're no longer his direct vassal, but his subject as a subject of the state.
That is a genuinely interesting way to view it. Largely speaking, what people don't assume, especially with absolute monarchism, and especially pre-French Revolutionary absolute monarchism, maybe some people know of the Romanovs with their sprawling bureaucracies, but absolutism, surprisingly, especially in its later in its immediate post-French incarnation, was an extremely bureaucratic thing. In fact, and indeed fact, everyone knows about Versailles and how the king used Versailles to essentially weaken and defang the nobility. It's fun to know that the nobles, a select few group of nobles, did not actually participate in Versailles. They opted to not go, essentially. And these nobles largely came from a region which would later spawn the Vendée royalist insurrection. The base idea here, and I'm trying to hint at, is that if France was as feudal as it was supposed to be, or as its detractors said it was, it most likely wouldn't have had the French Revolution in the first place. The French Revolution, despite feudalism by that point being a very morbid and dead system, is the result of essentially the death throes of feudalism rather than an inherent inconsistency within the nature of feudalism. In fact, the regions that rose in rebellion to defend the monarchy, religiously or linguistically inspired as they might have been, arose in areas where the country was at its most feudal, in the Loire Valley and in the Vendée. So, in short, the late absolutistic French state was a bloody mess, of which we would not see until Nazi Germany, really, in terms of being so horribly, of having the most atrocious internal administration ever conceived by man.
I think. Sorry.
Go on. You first.
The other primary sort of cause of the end of feudalism, really, because obviously, as you say, the end of a lot of the time, what the absolutists were doing when they were sort of destroying feudalism is that they were removing the local lord, as you sort of implied. So you get sort of high degrees of absenteeism. You obviously still get sort of feudal dues and those kinds of things. It is sort of an interesting point of note, really, that that kind of system, even of feudal dues, that really only started properly dying with sort of the German revolutions, the various. So in really even into the 1850s, there's still people who are legally serfs in mainland Europe. 1880s, I think, is when the serfs in Russia.
1860, I think.
1861 is the letter of emancipation by Alexander II. There's a very funny anecdote about this when during the Prussian Revolution in 1848, a then young Bismarck tries to exert his feudal lordship over a group of people to try to get them to join in the pro-king side of the protests. But then the army sort of shoo him off and say, oh, well, you can carry water and stuff for us. And then he thinks, oh, well, that's not worth my time. And then he gives it up. But so it's funny that he still has this idea that he is a feudal lord, even though feudalism is pretty much a nothing by then. But it sort of remains as a ghost in the law.
Yeah, and the memory, the ghost of feudalism lives on today. I was going to segue to the modern listener, you might think, well, especially to the modern urban listener, really, you might think, oh, absentee landlords couldn't have been that bad. That couldn't have killed a system in the last 300 years. Think for a second in your own life. Think the hell that is to deal with an absentee landlord, especially when renovations to the building have to be done. That's bad. Now imagine that everywhere.
And also imagine you can't text your absentee landlord. You have to send him. Someone has to get a
Any
horse,
appointed.
and they have to ride, and they might get dysentery on the way there. It's complete.
You have to give them enough money to pay the over 75 different internal tolls.
And then he has to stop, and he has to get a fresh horse, and then he might give it to someone else, and he might get held up by a highwayman, and you have no way of knowing if any of that happened. And
plus, here's the kicker: due to how French noble law worked, imagine the letter did, by grace of God, get to your feudal lord, and it said there, Lord, we need money, and then you realize, and then your lord carefully had to tell you, I'm flat out fucking broke. Because fun fact, the nobility by the time the French Revolution was bankrupt. Like, the French had an actual term to describe people of higher social standard who were poor, and this was called Gentile poverty. Not Gentile in the terms of soft, but Gentiles in terms of gentry, kinda.
Genteel poverty.
Genteel poverty. Because if you were a French noble, and if you did not, and pray to heavens your house did not lose all of their money, you could not legally work. In fact, if you worked, you legally lost the right to call yourself a noble. You could either work for the state as a bureaucrat, as a soldier, and that's about it. You could either work for the state or it's peasantum to you. Understandably, many nobles did not actually pay taxes, an important part of the main vindications of the French populace. The issue is that most of them were essentially living off royal grants of money. They were penniless and destitute because they had to live in Versailles, and living in Versailles was absurdly expensive.
yes, and you had to buy court clothes and champagne, and it got expensive very quickly.
Very fast. So essentially, the vast majority of the French nobility was broke beyond actual conception, and if you ask, what do you mean they couldn't? That if a noble holds something as quote unquote peasant, has a hostel, and made money from it, that was reason enough for him to no longer be considered noble.
Yes, people wonder today why would the great men of France step over each other's heads to wipe the king's bottom, but they needed some way to make a little bit of extra money.
Yes, technical poverty is absurd, humiliating, and often encourages little sympathy, because fucking hell. I'm so poor, don't buy the satin sheets then. Well, I have to buy the satin sheets, otherwise I'm poor in influence.
Yes, I lose my influence with the king, and then he won't let me wipe his bottom, and then
I won't get the money.
Yeah.
In short, the grandees of France were, not that grandees at all. So that also plays a role into the decay of the institution of feudalism. The all-powerful nobility was, by that point, not all-powerful, and, in order to keep financially afloat, had to do what was called marriages à la mode, marriages as is popular as is fashion, which is essentially they marry into rich bankers and rich bankers and rich merchants essentially, and they famously try to extract exorbitant dowries in order to get money. Well, that covers the death of feudalism and how it impacted the French Revolution. Now, God, we're going to this at a snail's pace.
Yeah, I mean, this is quite a topic. We went rather more in depth than I expected.
Me too, but like, there's a reason why this podcast is called Monarchism Unfiltered, because it is a wasted effort trying to filter it.
Indeed.
It's bloody impossible. Okay. So
Where do we leave off?
We covered the French Revolution, we covered the death of feudalism, we covered almost everything except what did the Maestre actually say? Now, there is a reason I and many consider the Maestre the year zero of monarchism, because, well, he's the first one to create of it in an ideological sense. What do I mean by an ideology? Well, let's use an invented definition of ideology for simplicity's sake, for fuck's sakes. The base idea is this. He was the first to create a base definition and justification for the existence of a monarchy. B, presented a set of easy to imagine in your head justifications and cases where it worked well. And C, created this is kind of important, not necessarily to monarchism in itself, though it's important for modern-day monarchism. The aesthetic of monarchism, specifically the medievalist aesthetic of monarchism, goes directly back to the Maestre. He famously called the pre-French revolutionary monarchism as flamboyant and essentially not pious because it was so extravagant. He wanted a monarchy closer to God. Famously, his vision of monarchism is encapsulated in the phrase throne and altar monarchism, also known as reactionary monarchism. That is birthed in the immediate reaction to the French Revolution.
I mean, there's no really sort of perspective or framework in which you could put it before then.
Yep, as said, monarchism only became a defined thing as an ideology. Well, quote unquote, it's still an ideology filled with its particulars, but an ideology nonetheless. But it really could only really start to define itself as a thing once it stopped being all that was, essentially. Okay. So, this is year zero of monarchism illustrated from its ancient history to year zero.
Yeah. That seems like a good place to wrap up for one episode.
Yeah.
So, goodbye from us over at Monarchism Unfiltered.
Feel free to send questions to I hope Bronze puts the email in the description.
I will try to. Goodbye.
Goodbye.